The realization came at different times for different men, but it came for all of them eventually. For some, it was the moment the Soviet trap closed on November 22, 1942. For others, it was when the last supply plane stopped coming in January. For many, it was the day they understood that the distant thunder of Manstein's rescue attempt had faded into silence, and no one was coming to save them. This is the story of how 250,000 German soldiers came to understand they were already dead men, trapped in a frozen hell with no way out. Obergefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann kept a diary throughout the Battle of Stalingrad, one of the few personal accounts that survived from inside the pocket. His entries from October 1942 were full of confidence and dark humor. "The Russians are stubborn, but we are Germans. We will take this cursed city." By November, his tone had changed. "We are surrounded. The officers say relief is coming. I want to believe them." By December, despair filled every line. "The horses have long been eaten. I would eat a cat now. We are all going to die here." The German Sixth Army that entered Stalingrad in September 1942 was one of the most powerful military formations in the world. It comprised over 250,000 men organized into 20 divisions, supported by hundreds of tanks, thousands of artillery pieces, and the full might of the Luftwaffe. These were veteran troops who had conquered Poland, smashed France, and driven deep into the Soviet Union. They believed themselves invincible. Stalingrad was supposed to be their final triumph before winter quarters. But the city that bore Stalin's name refused to fall. The Soviets fought with a fanaticism the Germans had never encountered. Every building became a fortress. Every street became a killing ground. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats, because soldiers crawled through sewers and tunnels, fighting in basements and attics, sometimes on different floors of the same building. Progress was measured in meters, purchased with thousands of lives. By November, the Sixth Army had captured most of Stalingrad, pushing the Soviets back to narrow strips of land along the Volga River. General Friedrich Paulus, the army commander, believed victory was within reach. Just a few more weeks of fighting would finish the job. His staff officers prepared victory celebrations. They had no idea that the Soviets were preparing the greatest counteroffensive of the war. On November 19, the world exploded. Soviet artillery opened fire northwest of the city with a fury that seemed to split the earth. 3,000 guns fired simultaneously, targeting the Romanian Third Army that protected the German left flank. The Romanians, equipped with obsolete weapons and lacking anti-tank guns, stood no chance. Within hours, Soviet tanks poured through massive holes in the line, racing west to complete an encirclement. Lieutenant Franz Siegel was with a German liaison unit attached to the Romanian forces when the offensive began. He later described the chaos. "The Romanians simply vanished. One moment we had an Allied army protecting our flank. The next moment, there was nothing but fleeing soldiers and approaching Russian tanks. I reported to headquarters that our entire flank had collapsed. The officer who took my report didn't believe me. He thought I was exaggerating. I wasn't." 24 hours later, a second Soviet offensive smashed into the Romanian Fourth Army south of Stalingrad. Again, total collapse. The two Soviet pincers raced toward each other, their objective a small town called Kalach on the Don River. If they met there, the entire Sixth Army would be trapped. German officers watched the developing disaster with growing horror, but they were powerless to stop it. Every reserve had already been committed to the fighting inside Stalingrad. There was nothing left. On November 22, Soviet forces linked up at Kalach. The encirclement was complete. Over 250,000 Axis soldiers were now trapped in a pocket measuring roughly 30 miles east to west and 20 miles north to south. For many German soldiers, this was the first moment of realization. Corporal Hans Decker wrote to his wife, "We are surrounded, Liebling. They tell us not to worry, that relief is coming soon. But I see the fear in the officers' eyes. They are lying to us. I don't know if this letter will reach you." If it does, know that my last thoughts were of you and the children." General Paulus immediately requested permission to break out while his forces still had fuel, ammunition, and fighting strength. Every military professional understood that staying in the pocket meant eventual destruction. But the request had to go through the chain of command to Adolf Hitler, and Hitler lived in a fantasy world where German armies never retreated. His response came swiftly: "The Sixth Army will hold Stalingrad. There will be no retreat." For some soldiers, this order was the moment of realization. Major Joachim Stempel, a battalion commander, later recalled, "When we received Hitler's order forbidding withdrawal, I knew we were doomed. You could see it in the men's faces. They understood what it meant. We were being sacrificed for Hitler's prestige. The Führer cared more about a city's name than about our lives. That was when I stopped believing in victory. I started thinking only about survival." Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, made a promise that gave false hope to the trapped army. He assured Hitler that his aircraft could supply the pocket entirely by air, delivering 500 tons of supplies daily. This was the minimum the Sixth Army needed to survive: food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, winter clothing. Göring's promise meant they could hold out indefinitely while relief forces assembled. The promise was a complete fantasy. The Luftwaffe simply didn't have the aircraft, the fuel, the trained crews, or the operational capacity to deliver anything close to 500 tons daily. They had perhaps 100 Ju-52 transport planes available, scattered across various bases. Even if every plane flew perfectly, completing multiple sorties daily in perfect weather, they couldn't deliver the promised tonnage. And weather in the Russian winter was never perfect. Captain Peter Baumann, a Luftwaffe transport pilot, knew the airlift was doomed from the start. "We were ordered to perform miracles with inadequate resources. My plane could carry maybe 2 tons per trip. We faced blizzards, Soviet fighters, anti-aircraft fire, and airfields inside the pocket that were under constant bombardment. On a good day, I could make one supply run. Many days we couldn't fly at all." Göring's promise was either incompetence or lies, probably both. The first supply flights arrived on November 24, and immediately the gap between promise and reality became apparent. Instead of 500 tons, perhaps 50 tons reached the pocket. Soldiers waiting at the airfields watched as a handful of planes landed, unloaded meager supplies, then took off again. That was it. That was the great airlift that was supposed to save them. For many men, this was the moment of realization. They had believed Göring's promise because they desperately needed to believe it. When they saw the pathetically small number of aircraft, the tiny amount of supplies, they understood the truth. No airlift would save them. Lieutenant Karl Osterhild wrote in his diary, "Only 3 planes arrived today. 3. We need hundreds. This is not an airlift. This is a death sentence delivered slowly." Rations were cut on November 26, just 4 days after the encirclement. Each soldier would now receive 2/3 of normal daily allocation. The announcement was met with grim silence. Everyone understood what reduced rations meant. Supplies were already running critically low, and the airlift wasn't working. On December 1, rations were cut again to half the normal amount. Men began to go hungry. The psychological impact of hunger is devastating. It's not just physical weakness, though that comes quickly enough. It's the constant gnawing emptiness, the obsessive thoughts about food, the way hunger dominates every waking moment until nothing else matters. Soldiers who had faced death bravely in combat became desperate animals fighting over scraps of bread. Discipline began to erode as the most basic survival instinct. The need to eat overwhelmed military training. Sergeant Otto Ruhel described the decline. "By early December, we thought about nothing but food. Conversations that used to be about tactics or women or home became entirely focused on meals we remembered, recipes we knew, restaurants we'd visited. We fantasized about food the way starving men always do. When you're truly hungry, Nothing else exists in your mind. Military duty becomes abstract. Food becomes everything. The cold arrived with merciless intensity as December deepened. Temperatures dropped to -20 degrees Celsius, then -30, then lower still. German soldiers wore the same summer uniforms they'd been issued in June when Operation Blue began. The Wehrmacht had failed to supply winter clothing, believing the campaign would end before winter. That catastrophic miscalculation now killed thousands. Frostbite became epidemic. Soldiers lost fingers, toes, ears, noses to the cold. Men who fell asleep on guard duty often never woke up. They simply froze to death at their posts. Those who did wake found their weapons frozen solid, unable to fire. The cold penetrated everything. It made metal burn skin on contact. It made breathing painful. It made every moment agony. Private Werner Gottlieb wrote, "I cannot describe the cold to you because you have never experienced cold like this. It is beyond description. It is a physical presence that attacks you, invades you, tries to kill you every second. My feet are black with frostbite. I cannot feel them anymore. Many of my comrades have already lost fingers or toes. We burn anything we can find, furniture, books, pieces of houses, but it's never enough. We are freezing to death slowly." For some men, the cold brought the final realization. They understood they couldn't survive a Russian winter in summer clothing without adequate food or shelter. Even if they won every battle, even if relief arrived tomorrow, many would die simply from exposure. The environment itself had become their enemy, more deadly than Soviet bullets. On December 12, hope briefly returned. General Erich von Manstein launched Operation Winter Storm, a desperate attempt to break through the Soviet encirclement and rescue the Sixth Army. German panzers drove forward with determination, fighting through Soviet defenses, advancing toward the pocket. By December 19, they had reached the Mishkova River, just 30 miles from the perimeter. Rescue seemed possible. Inside the pocket, soldiers listened to the distant thunder of Manstein's guns and allowed themselves to believe. After weeks of despair, suddenly there was hope. Some units began preparing to break out, to fight their way toward the approaching rescue force. Officers calculated that if Paulus ordered an immediate breakout, they could link up with Manstein within days. They could escape, but Hitler forbade any breakout. The Sixth Army must hold Stalingrad. Paulus, despite his professional judgment screaming that this was madness, obeyed. His army would not move. They would wait for Manstein to reach them. And Manstein, facing fresh Soviet armies, running low on fuel, unable to advance further without support, had no choice but to withdraw on December 23. For the soldiers who had listened to those guns growing closer, this was perhaps the cruelest moment of realization. They had been so close to salvation, 30 miles, less than a day's march. And now the guns were fading, growing distant, disappearing. No one was coming. No one could save them. They were truly alone. Corporal Friedrich Engels wrote, "We heard Manstein's guns for days. We believed he would reach us. We were already packing our equipment, preparing to march out to meet him. Then the guns stopped. Silence. The officers told us Manstein had been forced to withdraw. Some men cried openly. Others just stared at nothing. I think that was the moment most of us understood we would die here. The last hope had died with those fading guns." Christmas 1942 was the bleakest holiday any of these men would ever experience. In Germany, their families gathered around warm fires, singing carols, opening gifts, believing propaganda reports that the Sixth Army was holding heroically and would soon be relieved. In Stalingrad, those same soldiers huddled in frozen bunkers, sharing tiny portions of horse meat, fighting over scraps of bread. The rations had continued to shrink. By Christmas, soldiers received barely 300 calories per day, less than a quarter of what a man needs in Arctic conditions. They were literally starving to death. Their bodies consumed muscle mass for energy. Faces became skeletal. Eyes sank into skulls. Hands trembled with weakness. Many men lacked the strength to fight, barely able to walk. Lieutenant Hans Schmidt wrote his final letter home on Christmas Eve. "Dearest mother, I don't know if you will receive this. We are starving, freezing, dying slowly. There is no hope of rescue. I want you to know that I thought of you at the end of home, of better days. Tell father I was brave. Tell Anna I loved her. I am not afraid to die, but I am so tired, so hungry, so cold. Forgive me for not coming home. Your loving son, Hans." His body was found 6 days later. He had starved to death. The psychological toll of hopelessness is as deadly as physical deprivation. When men lose all hope, they lose the will to live. Suicides increased dramatically after Christmas. Some men shot themselves. Others simply walked away from their units into the snow, sitting down to die. A few attacked Soviet positions alone in suicidal charges, seeking death in combat rather than slow starvation. Captain Werner Hartmann, a company commander, described the mental collapse. "Hope is what keeps soldiers fighting when everything else is gone. When you take away hope, you break them completely." By January, I had men who simply stopped. They wouldn't follow orders, wouldn't eat the meager rations we had, wouldn't take cover during bombardments. They had given up. They knew they were dead and were just waiting for death to make it official. The wounded suffered most horrifically. Field hospitals overflowed with casualties, but there were no medical supplies to treat them. No antibiotics, no anesthesia, no bandages. Doctors performed amputations with hacksaws while other soldiers held down screaming patients. Many died from shock or infection. The wounded who couldn't walk were left in unheated buildings where most froze to death within days. Dr. Heinrich Hopp, a medical officer, kept notes throughout the ordeal. "I am a doctor, trained to heal, and I can do nothing. Men die of infections that penicillin would cure in days, but we have no penicillin. I amputate gangrenous limbs without anesthesia because we have nothing for pain. The screams haunt me. Many beg me to let them die. Some beg me to kill them. I cannot, I will not, but I understand why they ask. This is hell." By mid-January, the situation had deteriorated beyond anything imaginable. The last functioning airfield inside the pocket was captured by Soviet forces on January 16. No more supply flights could land. The Luftwaffe tried dropping supplies by parachute, but most fell into Soviet-held areas or were simply lost. The airlift, inadequate from the start, had now completely failed. On January 10, the Soviets launched their final offensive. They offered surrender terms. The Sixth Army would be treated according to international law, wounded would receive medical care, all would be repatriated after the war. General Paulus, following Hitler's orders, refused. The answer broadcast into the pocket was brief: unconditional rejection. For the soldiers who heard this announcement, it was confirmation of what they already knew. Their leaders had condemned them to death. Hitler wouldn't allow surrender. Paulus wouldn't disobey Hitler. They would fight until they died or were captured. There would be no honorable negotiated surrender, no mercy, no reprieve. The Soviet assault compressed the pocket steadily. Artillery pounded the remaining German positions day and night. Tanks and infantry attacked from all directions. The few German strongpoints that resisted were overwhelmed by sheer weight of numbers. By January 25, the pocket had been split into two sections with no communication between them. In these final days, different men found different ways to face the end. Some fought with fanatical determination, defending hopeless positions because duty demanded it. Others surrendered at the first opportunity, grateful to end the ordeal. A few committed suicide rather than face capture. Most simply endured, too weak and numb to care anymore, waiting for whatever came next. Private Kurt Ruber, a pastor serving as a medical orderly, drew a Madonna and child on the back of a Soviet map during these final days. The drawing, later known as the Stalingrad Madonna, depicted the Virgin Mary sheltering the infant Jesus with the words light, life, love written around the border. It became a symbol of hope and humanity persisting even in the depths of hell. Ruber died in Soviet captivity, but his drawings survived. On January 31, Soviet troops stormed General Paulus's headquarters in the basement of the Univermag department store. The newly promoted field marshal, Hitler had promoted him the previous day with the clear expectation that he would commit suicide rather than surrender, was captured along with his staff. He had defied Hitler's expectation by choosing life over death. The final German resistance ceased on February 2, 1943. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. Of the 250,000 men encircled on November 22, approximately 91,000 survived to enter Soviet captivity. The rest, 159,000 men, had died in the pocket. Of those 91,000 prisoners, only about 6,000 would ever return home. Most died in Soviet camps from typhus, dysentery, and the lingering effects of their ordeal at Stalingrad. The moment of realization, the desperate moment when German soldiers understood they would never leave Stalingrad, came at different times for different men, but it came for all of them. Some realized it immediately when the trap closed. Others held on to hope until Manstein's retreat. A few believed in rescue until the final days. But eventually, in that frozen hell, every man came to understand the same terrible truth. They had been abandoned, sacrificed, condemned to death by leaders who cared more about prestige than lives. That realization, more than the cold or hunger or Soviet bullets, broke the German Sixth Army. Not all at once, but slowly, steadily, inevitably. And when the end finally came, for most it was almost a relief.